I've called this From the Golden Age to Modernism. When we talk about the Golden Age, we're looking at the 1950s, which was the very first time Japanese cinema started getting introduced to the West. The film that's usually seen as introducing Japanese cinema to the West is Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon. Won the May Prize at Venice Film Festival in 1951, and that led to this resurgence, well, so not resurgence, a surge of interest in Japanese cinema in European film festivals, and introduced names of people like, well, Kenji Mizoguchi and Akira Kurosawa suddenly became big names that film critics at the time were looking at. Most of the films being introduced to the West fell under the category of jidaigeki, which is period dramas. We like the historical sort of swords and samurai aspect of Japanese cinema. One of the great masters of Japanese cinema we associate now with the era, Yasujiro Ozu, focused on contemporary dramas, gendaigeki, and even though we think of him as this towering figure in the 50s, actually none of his films got shown really in the West in the 50s, apart from Tokyo Story played at the London Film Festival in 1958. But it really wasn't until there was retrospectives in the 60s, just as he was actually just died, that people came to really experience his films. All the highbrow critics, of course, were talking about Kurosawa, Mizoguchi, Ozu. But actually most people experienced another side of Japanese cinema, which was Godzilla in the bottom, and that was when these films that were very popular in Japan at the time started getting sold and re-edited in dubbed versions to US television, and that set up its own sort of subculture of people really interested in the so-called kaiju eiga, or monster movies. One of the unique properties of Japanese film in the 1950s was that it was totally dominated by 6 companies who all controlled, they produced their own films and they distributed them through their own network of cinemas and outlets which they owned themselves. One of the downsides of this studio system was it didn't leave a lot of room for independent production. So what you had were basically commercial mainstream movies, each of the companies specialising in its own, sort of cultivating its own brand. Now this golden age came to an end because in the late 50s the big threat, of course, was television. So television arrived in the mid-50s, but it was very expensive. It was a sort of modern consumer good and only owned by a few wealthy people, but obviously it was beginning to saturate into people's homes. So by 1965, the technology had infiltrated into 60% of the nation's homes, and this would be 95% by 1970. So you can see anyway this dramatic, this peak in 1958, and then it falls very rapidly. So a lot of people always talk about, you know, the 60s, the birth of the new wave, and all these different things that happened during the decade. So what Shochiku did was they picked their sort of 3 sort of young talents who all had a chance to make their debut films while they were still under the age of 30, and they would attempt to sort of add a bit of politics and a bit of grit to the stuff and make films that appealed to the younger audiences, the sort of college crowd who weren't happy to sit at home watching TV with mum and dad. So the most important of these is Nagisa Oshima, who passed away just 2 weeks ago. Oshima is best known in the West for In the Realm of the Senses from the mid-70s, which is the one that blurs the line between art and pornography. It's a very, you know, scandalous film when it came out because it featured quite strong, well, very strong sex scenes. But in the 60s, Oshima was making very Japanese films and very, very critical of the older generation, of the sort of philosophy that got Japan into the war. Main one, though, that made his name is Cruel Story of Youth, which was a youth movie, and it featured a very political context, and it basically had this message in it that, you know, all the older generation are corrupt, they're forcing their corruption down on the younger generation, but it was sort of contextualised within all these political demonstrations that were going on at the time. The other major figure of the new wave is Shohei Imamura, whose Pigs and Battleship we're going to see tonight. Imamura started off in Nikatsu Studios, making very commercial films. Pigs and Battleships was still at Nikatsu Studios, so it fits within a commercial template before he went off and left and did more experimental stuff. One film I absolutely love. It's a bit of a sprawling masterpiece of a movie, is Profound Desire of the Gods, which effectively ends the New Wave period because it wasn't a commercial success and it almost bankrupted Nikatsu, who he'd just gone back to make this film, and he spent about 2 years making it as well. And it's set on the southern islands in Okinawa, but looking at a very remote tribe of villagers who almost live in these real almost Stone Age conditions. And how their world is sort of turned upside down when big business comes from the mainland and builds a theme park there ultimately. And that leads us on to the main development in Japanese cinema, was that this vertically integrated structure I talked about from the 50s basically only gave a window to very mainstream films. So there was no art house sector at all. There was a company called ATG, the Art Theatre Guild, which was actually bankrolled by Toho Studios, who decided that there was definitely a market for not just arty Japanese films, but also stuff like Battleship Potemkin had never got released in Japan. The works of Buñuel had never been released. Polish films, French films. By setting up a chain of only about 10 cinemas or 12 cinemas originally in Japan, with the main one in the Shinjuku area of Tokyo, they could introduce these works to sort of the young sort of independent college crowd who were sort of just emerging at the time. So a lot of political stuff, lots of very formal experimentation that toyed with this mixture between documentary and fiction. Lots of it very arty, a bit self-indulgent at times, but some real masterpieces came out of this. But you see, at this time, we're seeing what was happening in Japanese cinema. Budgets were going down, there was more formal experimentation, there was more politics, and there was more sex. As a coder, basically what happened, the studio system pretty much crumbled around 1970. Toho stopped producing their own films and started making films out of house and focused on exhibition instead. Daiei went bankrupt in 1971, and Nikatsu was the only company that continued along this production line mentality, doing 6 films a month release, but it turned completely over to erotic films, following the lead of the pink film industry. And this really is the end of an era in Japanese cinema, but the beginning of a new era. So it's a good place to end.